universities have a unique role to play in society. Universities are the most forward-looking institutions of our society. Universities bring together the greatest intellectual energy and especially the energy of young people who are intent to make a better world. And that makes universities uniquely suited and uniquely responsible for our time. And my main argument today is we have a big job to do. We have a big opportunity to do it. And if the universities don't do it, nobody else is going to find the path to sustainable development. I've been now a practicing development economist for 32 years and a student of economics for 45 years. And I can tell you one thing: governments are not going to lead the way. They don't know how. They're trapped in short-term thinking. My government is crazy, to use a technical term. My president, I don't even know where to start. Nobody does. We do know where to end, though, with a new president. But we're not going to solve our problems if we're waiting for your government, or my government, even less likely, to solve the problems that are in front of us. And so the topic for me today is how we can get organized to do our part, knowing that our part is a major leadership challenge. Sustainable development is the key concept that brings us here. And it's very important for us to understand what it means and why we have these 17 goals at the center of our attention. We adopted the idea of sustainable development as a world community because our global economy does certain things well, but is doing other things miserably, dangerously, not serving human purposes. And sustainable development is the idea that we need to reorient our economic model from local to global in a way to meet human needs. What does our economy do well? It actually produces massive, unprecedented levels of output at unprecedented levels of efficiency on a global scale. What the world economy accomplishes is absolutely spectacular. Every year now, world output is about $125 trillion for the 7.5 billion people on the planet. We've reached an average output, per person for more than 7 billion people, of more than $17,000 per person, averaged over the entire world. It's simply astounding to think about that, because that level of wealth and productivity was beyond imagining in earlier eras. If anyone had said to an economist, much less to anybody else 50 or 100 years ago, the average output in the world will be more than $15,000 per person, that would have been deemed to be crazy, impossible. And to be told that that would be true for 7.5 billion people would have been thought a certain kind of madness. And who would have even dreamt 40 years ago that China would achieve more than 3.5 decades of double-digit economic growth, so that a society of 1.4 billion people would double and then double again and then double again, then double again, then double one more time for a 30-time increase in output over a 35-year period. That's what the modern world economy has made possible. And now India, also with 1.4 billion people, is growing at more than 7% per year. And this suggests that India is going to be doubling in economic output every decade, if not faster. So the world economy does this extraordinarily well. It produces and it achieves economic growth. And that's true even as we continue to suffer the lingering effects of the 2008 financial crisis and the slow growth in Europe and the United States, so-called. This is not a worldwide slow growth phenomenon. This has been a crisis of the North Atlantic region, because Asia has continued to grow rapidly all throughout this period. But if we had been told 40 years ago that the average production in the world would reach more than $15,000 per person, I'll tell you one thing that I'm sure I would have said, and that is, well, poverty would have been ended and people would be happy. And yet we have arrived at this affluence with continuing major crises of deprivation, with millions of people dying every year of their extreme poverty still, and with a profound crisis of confidence rather than the kind of euphoria that might have been expected to greet this kind of affluence. And I would have said, if I had been told this 40 years ago when I was a student of economics, I would have said, well, surely the world would have addressed every major challenge because money would not be the obstacle. We'd be rich enough and we'd have the technological means to address any big challenge, whether it's pollution control or ensuring the survival of biodiversity or the health of our oceans and the health of our atmosphere. The reason we have adopted sustainable development is that it has turned out that the world economy is doing one thing well and two things miserably badly. The world economy is achieving economic growth, but it is not achieving social justice. It is not ending the suffering of the poor. It is not narrowing the income inequalities. And even worse, it is rapidly bringing us to the very edge of environmental catastrophe. And so the idea of adopting the Sustainable Development Goals is the idea that we need to combine three fundamental objectives in our public life. And that is the continued improvement of our material conditions, especially to end extreme poverty and to improve the lives of people who are still stuck near poverty levels, if not in extreme poverty. because technology allows that to happen. But to do that in a way that is socially fair, that is inclusive, that breaks down old barriers of gender or barriers against indigenous populations or minority groups, so that everybody can share in this prosperity, and does it in a way that is safe physically for our survival. Part of that remains to end the unbelievable dangers of nuclear war, which are still with us every day as risks on this planet, and we should never let down our guard even one day to the risks of our self-destruction, because we know our capacity to engage in that. But it's not only the weapons, it's the destruction of the physical bases of our survival. And we know that there are two fundamental environmental crises that we face. One is the human-made climate change that is now well underway, that has brought us 3 years in a row now of the warmest years recorded in the instrument record going back to 1880, and probably 3 of the warmest years in the last 4,000 years on the planet. And we know that that's just a hint of what would happen if we don't get the climate change under control. And the other fundamental environmental crisis is that humanity, by reaching 7.5 billion people, and by being so productive and our capacity to use primary resources in such volume, in such scale all over the world, is now fundamentally threatening the rest of the biosphere. In other words, one species, us, is appropriating about half of the world's land, water, ecosystem services, net primary productivity, that the rest of the biosphere, the rest of the plants and animals, can't find their place for survival right now on the planet, because we're pushing them right towards extinction. And climate change is doing part of it, pollution is doing part of it, diversion of water supplies is doing part of it, the destruction of habitat of other species is doing part of it, as we clear-cut massive forests, for instance, in Indonesia and Malaysia, to make room for massive plantations of monocultures, for example, of palm oil, thereby putting other species, our closest relatives, in that case the orangutans, or other great ape species, at the very risk of extinction. So sustainable development is a reflection of urgent need and of opportunity. To say that we can use our know-how, our technology, this unprecedentedly massive world economy for human well-being. In a sense, for me, it's hard to imagine any other choice. But then every day I wake up as an American citizen, and I realize there are other possibilities. And it's worth saying a word about my country, for an example, because it's both an important country and because it is a case in point of what can go absolutely wrong in our world. Because I believe the United States is certainly one of the most dangerous countries in the world today. And it is one of the countries whose politics is least in line with sustainable development. Our politics are now based on the idea that private property, not human well-being, is the center of social organization. The United States, for example, is the only country in the world that has not ratified the Convention on Biological Diversity to protect the biosphere. One country out of 193 UN member states. Why have we not ratified it? Because our right-wing political leaders said that protecting biodiversity threatened private property. They said that we will not ratify the treaty because it is within the rights of private property owners to destroy the biodiversity on their land, and that nobody should tell them otherwise. And we are now in an assault on nature in my own country. President Trump is kind of a wild caricature of this approach. The only thing the party in power dreams of is tax cuts and deregulation and repudiating global agreements of any kind. And this is why I say the United States is such a profound danger to itself and to the world right now. We actually came to teach these things in the United States. The sanctity of private property, that it is the goal above all other goals. Well, sustainable development points us in a fundamentally different direction. It says that our starting point is human well-being, not private property. Our starting point is the goal of creating a world that is fit for all. It also embodies a virtue that the Catholic Church calls the universal destination of goods, which is a doctrine of Catholic teaching that says while private property rights are fine and important even, they are never inviolate. And if private property ever comes into conflict with human need, it is the property rights that give way, not the human need that gives way. And so sustainable development is calling for a different philosophical approach for us. Start with what's important for us as human beings, and then design 21st century institutions, our public life, our public space, the working of government, the regulation of nature, or the regulation of human activity in nature, I should say, so that we're serving true, long-term, just purposes of social fairness, of prosperity, and of true environmental sustainability. The 17 Sustainable Development Goals are the best hope we have to achieve this vision. Let me give you a little bit of background about these goals, why we have them in this way. The idea of sustainable development is not new to 2 years ago. It's actually more than a quarter century old, but it has not worked yet. The term came into public awareness already back in 1987, 30 years ago, when one of our great statesmen of our time, Dr. Gro Brundtland, then the Prime Minister of Norway, headed a commission that said, we are on a collision course with nature. And she and her commission put forward the idea of sustainable development. And at that time, it was defined as meeting our generation's needs in a way that it will allow future generations to meet their future needs. And that idea was embodied in the Rio Earth Summit in 1992. All of the UN countries came together in Rio a quarter century ago to adopt sustainable development as the central concept and to adopt 3 major treaties. So these are the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification. 3 big treaties agreed in 1992. I teach those treaties every year. I have my students read them. If you haven't read them, I would urge you to go online and read these treaties. They're pretty short and they're very convincing. They were adopted 25 years ago. What happened was we adopted them and then basically ignored them or fought about them or gave speeches about them like I'm doing, but didn't implement them. As I said, the United States never even got around to ratifying the Biodiversity Treaty. I've never heard a US politician once in 25 years mention the Treaty on Desertification. And the only thing I've heard from most of our leaders about the Convention on Climate Change is by our current president, why we should have nothing to do with it. So we adopted these 3 treaties, and time went on, and in 2012 there was a 20th anniversary of the Rio Summit to see what had happened. And when the government officials got together in Rio again, the only conclusion was we failed. 3 good treaties, no results. The climate going out of control, biodiversity in a great extinction, and deserts continuing to expand, and those dryland regions, places of conflict, like Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan or Somalia or Ethiopia or Sudan. Those are the places that the Desertification Treaty was aiming to help. They gave no help at all. Those places are now at war. So in 2012, the governments were in a bit of desperation. What should we do? And they came up with one good idea. And they said, we have to do anything to let the public know that we are really in a crisis. We need to make these treaties not only legal instruments for diplomats and lawyers, we need to make this concept a living, breathing concept for global society and for politics. And so they adopted the idea of having sustainable development goals. You might say, that's it? And in a way, that's the best that they could come up with. And I don't have too much hope for governments doing much more than that unless we take the lead. That page of goals, they summarize the goals of improving material life and ending poverty, of making our societies more inclusive and just, and of combating environmental ills. And they do it in a very actually helpful way because they're very straightforward. They say that here for ending poverty or for health or for education or for climate or for cities are achievements that we can reach by the year 2030. And so they set specific milestones that are achievable at a global level. And for one of those important goals on climate change, the adoption of the Sustainable Development Goals was followed a few weeks later by the Paris Climate Agreement, which was reached in December 2015 in Paris, and it set some very specific targets, the most important of which is the global commitment to end the net emissions of greenhouse gases by around mid-century so that the world can keep global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial temperature. The key point for us is that these are the only global goals that we have for our generation, and the only global goals that we are going to have to help us reorient the world economy in a safe direction. They took 3 years to negotiate in the case of choosing the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and then they were unanimously adopted. The Paris Climate Agreement, you could say, took 25 years to negotiate because there was 25-year interval from adopting the framework convention to adopting the means for its implementation. For us, ladies and gentlemen, either we make these goals real and make them work, or we will fail in our generation to head off disaster. It's as simple as that. You might say it's unfair, especially the students. Who gave us that homework assignment? How come we're left with such a mess? And it's absolutely true that the previous generation of politicians has failed badly. And that's my generation too. And in the United States, as I've said, we've done even worse. We went back to sometime of the middle of the 20th century, because Donald Trump's idea of the world is to dig more coal mines and build more oil pipelines and pollute as fast as he can. To try to understand his mind is very tough. But the only thing I could say is he lives completely in the past and in illusions. He has no idea about living in the 21st century and about our current and future needs. But that's where we come in, because these goals are what we absolutely need, and for young people here, what you need for your safety and for the safety of the world and for future generations. To my mind, this is as close as I can think to the kind of challenge that I remember as a very young boy growing up in the United States in a very different age, when I had a president who we admired, even revered, compared to the one we have today. Because President Kennedy had the idea that our purpose was to solve great problems. One of the problems that he wanted to solve was the Cold War, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But in this picture, President Kennedy is calling on the American people in a famous speech in May 1961, 56 years ago, to take up the challenge of the moonshot. I believe sustainable development is the moonshot of our generation. President Kennedy said this: "I believe that this nation, the United States, should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. So President Kennedy went to the American people and he said, I believe that we should go to the moon. And more than that, he didn't say we should try that, he said we should do it this decade, not someday. And then he didn't say, like a politician would say today, don't worry, it's easy and it's cheap. He said none will be so difficult or expensive. And in this famous speech, saying to the US Congress that day, do not do this unless you're ready to pay for it. This is not going to be easy. It's not going to be quick. It's not going to be cheap. Don't do it halfway unless you're ready to bear the cost. And of course, at the end of the speech, the whole Congress rose to its feet and adopted President Kennedy's goal. And 8 years later, Neil Armstrong walked on the moon in a feat of technological genius that is almost unimaginable in this day, except for the fact that if we tried it, we could do so many wonderful things like this. And when we do occasionally try it, for example, sequencing the human genome, again and again we show these great challenges can be accomplished ahead of schedule when we put our best minds to it. What President Kennedy did with the moonshot was focus America on that goal, inspire people, mobilize resources, and it took 500,000 employees of 20,000 companies working together under one umbrella created by the US government to accomplish the job in a little over 8 years. Sustainable development has the same features. We have to decarbonize the energy system. We have to shift from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles. We have to make agriculture environmentally sound rather than extensive and destroying habitat, polluting the environment, and draining the groundwater regions of the world. We have to make healthcare available for all. Sustainable development puts the human being first, and it calls on us in SDG 3 to ensure universal access to health coverage. And SDG 4 calls on us to achieve universal access to quality education, at least through a secondary level for every child in the world. So my call to the universities is this. These are complex, technologically based challenges. These cannot be accomplished with business as usual. These cannot be accomplished by the incumbent businesses in the world. And in many cases, especially in the case of the oil, gas, and coal industry, those companies basically have to close down by mid-century to a large extent. There's no real role in this world for coal companies anymore because we do not have the atmospheric capacity to handle their CO2 emissions. But what we do have is ample solar energy, wind energy, geothermal potential, hydroelectric potential, fourth-generation nuclear energy, at least some areas of advanced bioenergy, some potential for carbon capture and sequestration, the potential for self-driving electric vehicles or fuel cell vehicles, nanotechnologies that are vastly more energy efficient, batteries that can quickly charge and recharge at grid scale, flow batteries and other technologies that can provide storage for intermittent energy sources, new information technologies to make healthcare available on your smartphone. Information technology can revolutionize education so that even in places where there are no teachers, there can be learning and connection to worldwide information, and on and on. I don't see the limits because we are in such a revolutionary period of technological advance that it is wrong-headed to think that any of these goals is out of reach. And if you can land on the moon in 8 years when there were barely computers, and the one computer that NASA had less computational power than any of our smartphones, and still you could go to the moon, we can figure out how to make sure that our $17,000 per capita world economy can meet everybody's health needs, education needs, and energy needs in a productive, just, and sustainable manner. Now, for us at universities, let's understand, governments will not be able to do this. They do not know the technological changes. Their job is not to think, it's to hold power. Their time span is not 2030 or 2050, it's the next election. They are all enmeshed in short-term politics, and they cannot think straight. And that's why the universities have to step forward. Of course, with teaching and training, that goes without question because no other institution is charged with that. Of course, with basic research, because our universities are the home of the world's leading basic research, often in collaboration with industry. But now, with the generation of public policy ideas, of roadmaps, of milestones, and of the convening of civil society to help get this work done. Let's work together to show that the Sustainable Development Goals are practicable, that they will boost the economy, they will create jobs and opportunities, they will promote fairness because that's their design, and they will project and protect the fragile ecosystems of this country and its neighborhood. And this is a region of unified history of thousands of years that is in crisis right now. It's in geopolitical crisis because of the divide of the Christian and Muslim world. It is in ecological crisis because the Mediterranean basin is warming and drying. It is in ecological crisis because the Mediterranean itself is profoundly polluted with microplastics and other pollutants. And the solutions for the Mediterranean require Mediterranean leadership to save the Mediterranean from environmental threats that are very, very grave, and also to make the Mediterranean economic system work once again for high levels of productivity, not the sick part of Europe, but the dynamic part of this region. So this is a worldwide calling. It's a worldwide opportunity. I think it is a worldwide necessity. I think it is your generation's greatest challenge. Thank you very much.